There's a preconception about games based on movies that I've never been able to get over. They typically give off the impression that the game only exists as an easy cash grab to write off the success of the film, and this is almost always what I expect going into it. This isn't true for every movie game that's been made, but I still can't help but be suspicious of these titles when I see them. There's a term for low-effort games that are made with the intent of making a quick buck, usually following common gaming trends and never shooting for anything above average. It's called shovelware. Most movie games fit this description, but we're not here to talk about most movie games. We're here to talk about a movie game. Is Tron Evolution a shovelware title? No, I don't think it is. Initially, my answer was yes, but after I started looking into the game's development, I quickly changed my mind. I can find respect for a mediocre game that was made with care or tried to go against the norm and do something different. I'll give credit where it's due. Evolution, despite its shortcomings, was designed with the right intentions, and I think that has helped me quell much of my apathy towards this game. But as we're about to see, good intentions aren't always enough to cause a breakthrough. Tron Evolution was the game to release alongside the 2010 Disney film Tron Legacy. Whether or not you like the movie is a matter of personal preference, but I know that I loved it as a child, and after rewatching it, I still think it's pretty good. Finding information on Evolution's development time wasn't easy. It took an extensive amount of research, and by extensive, I mean a full 15 minutes and I had to click on more than 10 links. Clickbait articles really do make finding actual information a bit tedious, but after an agonizing quarter of an hour, I finally found what I was looking for. A handful of developer interviews that I could have found much easier if I looked on YouTube instead of Google. This interview shows exactly what I was looking for: the intentions, expectations, and development time behind this game. Disney has a reputation of pumping out terribly made movie games, and the team at Propaganda Games apparently knew this too well. In an interview with the assistant producer, Patrick Shelley, he said, "Let's face it, most games based on movies suck. We don't want the players to be replaying the movie and feel like they've wasted their $60. That's why the story is completely unique. We work closely with the movie guys to make sure that the universe lines up, but also stands on its own." He also mentioned how he doesn't want people to spend $10 on a movie just to spend $60 to watch the movie again. This shows that, at the very least, the developers knew that the odds were stacked against them due to Disney's reputation, and they were trying to break the mold. I don't agree that the story of this game is entirely unique, but I am convinced that if they were given a little more time, they could have made something special. This game has the foundation of something great, it just clearly lacks more testing. In that same interview with Patrick Shelley, he said that they decided not to have any open or closed beta testing for the game, which led to the awkward situation of the interviewer encountering a bug that froze his character in place until they restarted the game. I think a lot of the jagged edges could have been smoothed out if they did offer some form of beta testing, and it may have resulted in a better game overall. It's much more likely that they didn't have enough time to do any real testing given the game's 15-month development cycle. That's hardly enough time to develop a game from scratch, but I think it explains why so many areas feel so shallow. The decisions that were made during the development period can still be felt today, and I'm not talking about just the gameplay. Evolution never released a digital copy on PC, so those who bought it needed to purchase a digital copy which went through Games for Windows Live. As of October of 2019, this version of the game can no longer be installed because it requires activation through Securom, and since Disney no longer has a contract with the company, the DRM prevents players from actually getting the game activated. It's a little bit sad to think that enough people actually wanted to play this game for this to become a widespread issue, but they can't because of a shitty DRM service that can't be bypassed. The multiplayer is an integral part of this game's design, and the fact that the servers are still active to this day means that there was at least some chance of a revival, only to be shut down by Disney's short-sightedness. I'm not an expert on DRMs, and I generally don't care about the ongoing debate, but things like this should never happen in the first place. But don't worry, PC players, you can always watch people like me talk about the game. No strings attached. My feelings on Evolution's gameplay are extremely mixed. On one hand, I think the variation between combat, platforming, and vehicle sections are well paced, but on the other, I feel like none of these are really that good individually. The same can't be said about the animations, which I found to be incredibly fluid and satisfying to look at. Out of curiosity, I decided to see what became of one of the game's animators, Alex Gatsis. After working on Evolution, he went on to work at Ubisoft, where he was the senior animator for Splinter Cell Blacklist, Far Cry 4, Assassin's Creed Black Flags and its DLC, and Assassin's Creed Unity. Good for you, Alex Gatsis. Seriously though, I think the animations in this game are very good, and it definitely adds some visual flair to the combat, which is complemented by the setting. It's a shame that de-resing enemies doesn't look near as interesting as it does in the movie, although that might have been too difficult and costly to animate at the time. I think this game looks incredible for something from 2010, but the music wasn't near as great of a fit for me. Some big names helped in the production of this game's music, including Chris Velasco, who has written scores for dozens of successful games. A few examples include Prototype, Mass Effect, God of War, Bloodborne, Overwatch, and many more. It's surprising to me then that the music in this game doesn't feel like it fits Tron's setting as well as it could have. I think the soundtrack contrasts heavily from the movie score written by Daft Punk. Obviously, Chris Velasco and Daft Punk are two completely different artists, so of course things aren't going to sound identical, but I think it's the difference in style that really got to me. Tron is quite literally a digital world, and you'd think that there would have been a heavier focus on electronic music like EDM or dubstep. The few tracks that matched the setting the most were taken from the movie's soundtrack, and most of the music in this game feels like it has a stronger emphasis on its orchestral parts. That's not to say that the soundtrack in this game is bad, but it didn't lean into its electronic side as much as it should have. There's a certain part halfway through the game that always sounded like Minecraft music, and that's the most memorable song I heard during my playthrough. The music could have served to elevate the experience, but unfortunately, it just falls flat. This brings us to the general gameplay, and as usual, I'll save the combat for last. Instead, let's talk about movement. The freeform movement style in this game is very similar to that seen in Prototype, so similar in fact that I spent the first 20 minutes of the game trying to figure out where I've seen it before. Ultimately, it was the lack of control that gave it away. I went into detail in my video on the Prototype games about how moving at high speeds was awkward to control with precision and made fighting in confined spaces a nightmare, but there weren't enough evasive maneuvers that were as reliable as sprinting. Evolution has the exact same problem, which is what made the game feel immediately familiar in the worst way possible. I'll talk more about running versus dodging in the combat section, so what I will say is that Evolution's slower running speed makes the issue much less of a problem than it was in Prototype, but it's still a problem. The biggest area of frustration was having to fight with the camera to perform the actions that I wanted to. There was a section where I fell to my death 3 or 4 times in a row because I was trying to climb onto an area to proceed, but the game would activate a wall run and send me flying off the map. The same thing happened to me during one of the boss fights, except in reverse. I wanted to activate a wall run to grab this collectible, but the game kept trying to climb instead. This issue happened more often than you would think, and it was always annoying. This wouldn't be too bad if you didn't need to constantly fight with the camera. The game moves the camera around as you move, which means that you will always be adjusting it as you play. It's also worth mentioning that the way the camera restricts your field of view while sprinting is more of a hindrance than it is a benefit to the system. This only happens when you're not in combat, which begs the question of why they bothered implementing the effect at all. When you're not having a power struggle with the camera, you'll find the movement in this game is generally very good. There's a little awkwardness here and there, but I think it holds up pretty well all this time later. There are ample opportunities to parkour around the arena during combat, and it's satisfying to pull off. The actual platforming only really exists as a way to break up the various combat sections, but I still found them generally enjoyable, except for a few different sections where something didn't work. A good example is when I couldn't activate a mag pull to progress to the next part of the level. This is an ability you have where you pull yourself to other enemies, but is most commonly used in platforming. Despite the fact that I was able to target onto the anchor, the game refused to pull me towards it, which resulted in 2 deaths. This is doubly frustrating because the first half of this platforming bit requires a very precise wall run in order to get enough distance off the jump to reach the grapple point, and this killed me enough times to be a headache. Other than that, there's not really a whole lot to say about the game's movement outside of how it functions in combat, so let's go ahead and move on to another area of gameplay. Vehicle sections. It takes a special kind of game for me to get through a tank section and think, please don't ever make me do that again. Tanks are awkward to control, and because of the constant camera movement, are far more likely to spin in circles instead of actually moving forward. This made tank combat a complete pain in the ass. Thankfully, there are only 3 of them, and only 2 of those require you to actually travel. Gameplay with tanks is pretty straightforward. You move, you shoot, and then you shoot with special abilities that are based on those you unlock throughout the course of the game. When you're not suffering at the hands of mandatory tank sections, you're engaging in the other, more common form of vehicle sections, light cycle chase sequences. These usually consist of you avoiding obstacles and hazards as you try to escape an area, and they're a lot of fun. Going through these sections at Mach 10 while narrowly avoiding something that could have killed you is an enjoyable experience, until you hit an invisible wall that kills you instantly and forces you to reload a checkpoint. Again, this happens more often than you would expect, and it serves to bring the entire section down. Thankfully, reloading a checkpoint in this game is extremely quick. It only takes about 5 seconds, which for the PS3 is damn impressive. When you're not platforming or having a high-speed chase, you're usually fighting enemies. This is where the combat comes in, and this is where I really start tearing into the game for its various issues. Some of the problems I faced were my own fault, but not all of them. Let's start with the basics. You can perform a small array of different attack combos that are no longer than 3 hits each, with a few small exceptions. You can hold the melee or ranged attack buttons to charge a more powerful attack that takes far too long to mix into any combos. You can top off a combo with a special attack that is related to one of the 4 disc modes in the game, but this costs energy and and there's no way to weave them into combos beyond that. You can also block attacks, which gives you access to the game's dodge roll, and attacking in this guard state is slow and does very little damage. Using a special move while in this state will do an AoE slam attack that doesn't feel as effective as some of the other abilities you have at your disposal. You can also perform what the game calls a parry, even though it's more of a counterattack. You throw your disc right after blocking the opponents, and it does a flashier move that does slightly more damage than a regular disc toss would. This isn't as useful as it seems for many reasons. For starters, you can still take damage while you're in the parry animation, and there is such a long recovery time afterwards that it's more of a liability to pull off than anything else. It really sucks that your dodges were relegated to this inefficient guard state that only offers a handful of attacks, especially since the animations look really cool. You also can't block if you've already thrown your disc since you don't have it, which means it only really benefits people who turtle while playing. I think giving the player an offhand light staff like the ones the black guards use would have worked better here. I mean, there's literally a unit that uses both the disc and the staff simultaneously, so the animations are already there, they just need to be applied to your character. The final and most effective way to fight is by sprinting around the arena, and this is the best method for just as many reasons as the others are inferior. While sprinting, you can throw your disc freely without having to deal with the recovery periods or annoying close-up action shots that break up the flow of combat. Performing a special attack while sprinting will cause you to perform a small AoE attack that seemingly does the most damage in the game, especially with the heavy disc mode since that can hit the enemies twice. These attacks can also be spammed as long as you have the energy to perform them, which almost became necessary on hard mode in some areas. Beyond that, you get a damage bonus if you perform an attack while platforming, and moving quickly makes it harder for enemies to hit you. Most of the time. The real selling point of this style for me was the fact that I could throw my disc indefinitely as long as I kept sprinting, so that's what I did for the entire game. That's not even mentioning that platforming is required to regain health and energy. You'll find these nodes around the arena that will refill your resources when you vault or wall run over them, and these will refill over time. If you're constantly moving around the arena, then you'll more than likely be close to a health node when you actually need one, whereas turtling up can put you in a tricky situation. I almost feel like the amount of resource refills available are little more than a safety net to make up for the combat's lack of balance, but in the game's current state, it's definitely necessary. I honestly wish the game would have committed to perfecting at least one of these combat styles instead of giving us 3 half-baked ones. Turtling up with your block will give you access to a variety of different dodges and a parry, but your options are far too limited for it to really be useful. The combos don't flow together very well and leave you with these awkward recovery animations after just 3 hits, which only open you up to receive more damage that you can't avoid because you can't block while in a recovery state. Sprinting around the arena allows you to attack indefinitely and take advantage of some bonus damage while parkouring, but you're restricted to very few attacks, and playing the entire game like this can get boring very quick. I wish Evolution would have taken after other third-person action games like God of War and offer a greater variety of attacks, because 3 hits don't do near enough damage to warrant this vulnerable recovery animation. The combat is never given a chance to flow, so it seldom feels satisfying. Let's answer the big question. Is this game fun? As far as PvE goes, you'd probably be better off playing it on easy or normal so you can feel like you're actually doing damage to your enemies. But I do think it's at least enjoyable. The multiplayer has a similar issue with bloated health bars, but this is at least mitigated with some halfway decent upgrades and the fact that some of the game modes are team-based. You're probably wondering at this time if the multiplayer is still active. Well, I couldn't find any public lobbies, and bots only spawn on maps that don't support vehicles, so it looks like the game has been totally abandoned, at least on PS3. The unfortunate thing is that there was a chance of people bringing the game back on PC if they could at least get it installed. I can see this game sparking a cult following of dedicated fans if they were able to install it, but sadly, Evolution is another in a long line of games that put time and development resources into their multiplayer mode just to leave it behind in the end. Multiplayer must have been a big part of this game's vision because of how it was included. If you approach any upgrade station in the story, you're given the option to jump into a multiplayer match to help level up your character before progressing. Unfortunately, the upgrades you can purchase are pretty bland, and it's not very clear which of them do and don't apply to the story mode. The tag that is meant to imply that they have no effect on your story character actually do. And this led to me ignoring a plethora of upgrades because the game told me they only apply to the multiplayer when they didn't. Just like God of War Ascension, this is likely something the developers decided to do despite the risks, and it no doubt took considerable resources that could have gone towards other areas of the game to make it happen. The modest success they achieved with it is impressive in its own right, but it wasn't enough to save the game from itself. Spoiler alert, this game sold less than 200,000 copies and led to the shutdown of the studio. I can't help but wonder how much more successful this game would have been if it didn't have the baggage of being another Disney-published movie game. So I think this is the first game on the channel where I have to issue spoilers for both the game and the movie it's based on. If I'm being honest, there isn't really much of a story to critique here, but it is a long-standing tradition on the channel for me to cover a game's story, no matter how insignificant, and considering it's basically all you're going to get out of this game nowadays, I suppose it's worth getting into. Tron Evolution's story serves as a prequel to Tron Legacy, and despite the developer's intentions, this game absolutely cannot stand on its own. Movie characters are introduced but never given any character development because all of it happens in the course of the movie. In fact, many things about the characters in this game don't really coincide with those in the film. The story in this game is little more than an excuse to have you running around killing things, and I think that could have worked if they didn't spend so much time trying to tie the events of the game into the movie. The game doesn't elevate the movie very much, and the movie doesn't leave much room for a prequel anyways. For everybody who hasn't and doesn't plan on watching the movie, don't worry. I'll be going over all the information that's crucial to understanding the game's main antagonist. I think it's really unfortunate that Evolution can't stand on its own merit, but probably the most disappointing thing is how neither this game nor the movie it's based on really explore the potential themes and concepts that they were hinting at. I think this is what ultimately holds the film back from being as successful as it could have been, but I also feel like this game could have expanded on these events much more than it currently did. As it is now, Evolution doesn't really add anything to Legacy's story. It doesn't hold a magnifying glass to the events that were referenced in the movie, it just repeats what was already said a little bit louder. Whether this is due to poor writing or rushed development, I can't say, but details are never properly expanded on in this game, which makes it feel even weaker as a tie-in than a standalone title. That's not to say this game doesn't have any good moments. There are several parts I can think of where a strong message is just waiting to be delivered, but it isn't because the writers didn't bother actually elaborating on anything about this world. I'll give a strong example of this when I break down the movie's plot and characters, and hopefully you'll be able to see why I take issue with this game's story. In its current state, it feels like a rough outline of plot points that never really build to anything meaningful, and that's secondary to the fact that it retreads much of the same ground as the movie, which was the complete opposite of what the developers intended with it. With that being said, let's get into it. I'll be spoiling the little amount of plot that this game has and much of the plot of the movie. I don't think this is a big deal for Evolution, but if you have a Disney Plus account and want to watch the movie first, you might want to do that. For everybody else, let's get into it. As I've stated a couple times so far, Evolution is a tie-in to Legacy, and in order to understand the game, you need to understand the movie. As opposed to breaking down the movie, I'll just be going over the timeline of events since most of Legacy's story is involving Kevin Flynn and his son, Sam. Following the events of the original 1982 Tron film, Kevin Flynn, who was the protagonist of that movie, decides to try and recreate the computer world that he found himself in. He takes a computer program, Tron, who helped him in the first movie, and brings him to this new system as a trustworthy security guard. Flynn also creates a digital copy of himself named Clue, who he tasks with helping him create the perfect system. It's revealed early in that movie that Clue was designed to think the same way a person would, which makes his programming far more complex than anything else on the grid. That is, until the discovery of the ISOs, programs that evolved in the system naturally and possessed free will. Clue believed the ISOs to be an imperfection, while Flynn believed them to be a miracle, and it's this disagreement that eventually leads to Clue staging a coup and forcing Flynn into hiding. Tron is presumed dead, and it's revealed late in the movie that he was reprogrammed to become Clue's top enforcer. He also systematically killed every ISO on the system except for one, who we'll meet later. The events of Clue's uprising are only mentioned briefly in the movie, but they're the cause of the dystopian system that Sam finds himself in early in the film. Evolution focuses entirely on the uprising for its story, although the extent of the focus is no more than what I just described. Clue begins his uprising, Flynn is ran into hiding, and the ISOs are killed. There's another antagonist in this game that is so lackluster that it's not even worth mentioning until we get into the actual plot. The issue with trying to make a game about this point in time that features all the characters from the movie is that there can't be any true stakes. It doesn't matter what happens throughout the course of the game, you know that Clue is successful, Cora and Flynn survive, and seeing as your character isn't in the movie, you can pretty much guess what happens to him. Anytime the game introduced somebody new, I automatically knew they were a goner because they weren't in the film, and it prevents the game from ever having any real tension. If you didn't see the movie and you knew nothing about the franchise going into this game, then you're going to be extremely confused as to why Clue is a carbon copy of Flynn, who the Underworld reject is, and what the hell is even going on. It's worth repeating here that this game was made in just 15 months, so it's unreasonable to think that you could create a full game with a mostly complete story in that amount of time. until you look at Fallout New Vegas and Dragon Age 2. Both of these games have some massive shortcomings, but for the most part, they tell a complete story and are impressively large given their development time. You could probably argue that Fallout New Vegas was just an asset flip of Fallout 3, so I can understand if you dismiss that one, but as far as story and side content goes, it's still a very big game. I would assume at this point that the developers either didn't give the story in this game much thought, or the inclusion of multiplayer took time away from its development. Evolution wasn't the first title from Propaganda Games to include multiplayer, but I imagine that it had some impact on the development. Regardless, I can't help but feel like this game's story didn't really need to be told, and it definitely doesn't add to that of the films. On that note, let's go ahead and get into it. Evolution begins with a recording of Flynn giving some basic background to the game. It's been 7 years since he created this new system and 5 since he discovered the ISOs. He talks about the unrest as the basic programs, which are those that were created to serve a specific function, occasionally clash with the ISOs. He mentions that even Clue seems different when he's around them, and he says that one of the ISO leaders, Jalen, was recently killed in the game grid, which he suspects was murder. He then says he's going to upload a new system monitor program to try and keep the peace. Again, if you've already seen the movie, then you know how this ends. You then gain control of your character, so I suppose we should take a moment to talk about him. In this game, you play as the system monitor Anon. This is either a coincidence or a 4chan reference, and it wouldn't surprise me if it was the latter. Anon is a voiceless protagonist, and the reason I don't say silent protagonist is because he's mute. It's actually sort of interesting despite never being brought up in the story, because it diegetically fixes many problems that silent protagonists have in video games, especially the awkward moments when your character knows something crucial but never brings it up, or they do bring it up off screen and there's this awkward moment of exposition where they repeat what you told them. Anon doesn't have a defined personality, which mostly works for this game because he was designed for combat. His job is to monitor, not speak. This is also represented in-game with the enemy tooltips that break down their weaknesses and resistances. This is more than just a tutorial message, it's your character analyzing his opponents and calculating the most effective way to deal with them. I think this is an interesting concept for a character, even if it isn't really used to the story's full advantage. I actually think the film would have been better if it did feature this character to offer some interesting action sequences. Technically, there is a character like this in the film, but he doesn't get near as much screen time as I think he should. Back to the story, you meet up with Tron and see another person getting into a fight with some guards. She claims that the leader of the ISOs, Radia, is expecting her at a ceremony for being promoted to system administrator. Security has been increased in the wake of Jalen's death, so they're not letting her in. She finally leaves, and you give chase to make sure she doesn't do anything illegal. This serves as your platforming tutorial. Don't be surprised if I don't talk about Cora much. She's not really an interesting character in the game or the movie. I think the fact that they gave her the Resident Evil / Underworld protagonist design always makes her feel like a cardboard cutout, and her personality doesn't help with that. As you follow her, you'll be attacked by some yellow zombie programs, which begins your combat tutorial. Once you're finished, you see Clue giving a speech to introduce Laura Bailey, Radia, as the first ISO system administrator. Your ceremony is interrupted when another yellow program, this time not a zombie, shows up and starts turning everybody else into zombies. He then starts clapping the security until you step in to keep him from getting to Clue. This then begins your first boss fight, which is presented in the form of another combat tutorial. You fight him off and break his disc, and then he runs off to be a nuisance for the rest of the game. Flynn and Tron arrive, and Clue tells them that this was a viral attack. Since nothing can get into the system without Flynn putting it there, Clue says that the virus must have evolved from an ISO. I do wonder how this turn of events came about. He says that the ISOs are a flaw, which causes Flynn to apologize and blame himself for the limitation in Clue's programming. He insists this isn't an insult, but that's kind of like apologizing to your kid for giving them a big-ass forehead, so I can see why this would be insulting. Tron says he'll escort Flynn to the portal so he can get out of the system, and you're told to chase down the virus. About 12 minutes later, you witness the start of Clue's uprising. This is actually a recreation of the scene from the movie, except it's a bit shorter since you get interrupted by one of Clue's sentries. I'll talk a little more about the scene later when I discuss why the final mission of the game should have been different. You fight off Clue's henchmen until you're met by Cora, who gives you a Magpul upgrade for platforming. You then meet her later on. She tells you to go find somebody named Zeus at a club called the End of the Line. You make it there, speak to Zeus for about 5 seconds, and the place gets bombed, beginning your first light cycle sequence as you drive down the collapsing building. Cora says that Clue must have known the club was a gathering spot for ISOs and targeted the attack. Following Zeus's advice, you travel to the ISO city of Arja to speak with Radia. Once you make it there, you see an APB has been placed out on you, blaming you for the spread of the Abraxas virus and the death of Flynn and Tron. You decide to travel through the city substation to avoid detection, and once you arrive, you see that Clue is telling Radia about their deaths. Once he leaves, you talk with her yourself, and after searching Cora's memories, because evidently the ISOs have a linked consciousness that is never brought up again in this game or the movie, you see that Tron is dead, but Flynn is still alive. Another ISO named Gibson smuggled him out of the city before being arrested. Cora is going to warn the other ISO factions about Clue's uprising, which is strange to me because the whole point of speaking with Radia in the first place is that she had the power to alert them. You know, linked consciousness. It's like the writers aren't even trying to hide the fact that it's just a plot device. Your job is to go hunt down Gibson and free him before he's killed. You do, and he locks you in the game grid instead of just escaping with you because the writers need an excuse to recreate the death matches from the movie. He swoops in with a recognizer to kill the one person I was actually looking forward to fighting, and you escape with him. He then drops you off at a place called the Bostrom Colony, which is an isolationist city for ISO outcasts who didn't want to live with the basic programs. You quickly find the place overrun with the Abraxas virus, and after fighting your way through, you're confronted with the big Darth Vader wannabe himself. Apparently he's too strong to beat right now, so you run away and overload the city's energy processor in hopes that the explosion will kill him. You then see that Clue's flagship is bombarding the colony, and you take Flynn's light cycle to escape. You're cut off by Abraxas, who somehow got ahead of you, and Gibson pushes your cycle out of the way to prevent you from getting hit with his attack. He's then infected and becomes a lackluster boss fight that consists of you running away until you're allowed to attack, and then destroying the health nodes that he infects until he's vulnerable. This is meant to be a big emotional moment where one of your allies dies, but I didn't even know his name until the game told me, so that shows just how much of an impact it had. You then take Flynn's light cycle to Arja City before it gets completely destroyed by Clue's army, which begins one of the most painful gameplay sections in the game. Combat against tanks on hard mode is a nightmare. Getting ran over by one will kill you instantly, although the game can't actually decide what does and doesn't define you getting hit by it. You have to remain in close distance because you can't throw your disc from the safe spaces and they're likely to fire on you from far away, but so much as touching the tank's barrel while it's driving will kill you instantly. You do next to no damage without using the bomb disc, so you can't just chill on top of it and ship its health away or you'll run out of energy. There are 2 tanks to kill in this section, and the second one would always run me over before I could kill it, which means that I would need to reload a checkpoint. What follows is another mandatory tank driving section, which is almost worse than killing tanks on foot. I already said it once, but any game that makes me say I never want to do that shit again after I get done driving a tank is doing something wrong. You then make it back to Radia and are pulled aside by Cora. She says that Clue hit every ISO settlement before they could prepare, and she only survived by staying hidden. Clue is busy taunting Radia for the death of all the ISOs, and Abraxas arrives shortly after. You learn that Abraxas is Jalen, and Clue is the one who turned him into a virus. This isn't explained in great detail, but all the ISOs are capable of becoming a virus. This is likely because of how they differ from regular programs. They have a natural instability that can evolve into a virus if the conditions are right. This also explains why Gibson became a boss fight whenever he was infected, when every other program turns into weaker fodder enemies. This is actually a really interesting concept that could give some great insight into how the ISOs operate on a genetic level. Oh, never mind, I guess we're done. So Jalen kills Radia, Cora runs off to try and kill Clue, and Abraxas is a boss fight now. You can't actually beat him regularly on hard mode. You have to attack after he does his slam and then lead him under falling debris to finish him off. This kills him, and you're then caught in a thermonuclear blast that levels all of Arja. Somehow you survive this when getting bonked by the barrel of a tank is enough to kill you, and you awaken to find Flynn next to you. He laments the fact that he couldn't have gotten out of the system to program you some allies and that he couldn't have prevented the deaths of the ISOs. Let's kick off this next tangent with the following dialogue.
I knew Clue had flaws, but genocide, man? The ISOs were a miracle. Why couldn't he see it? Why couldn't I show him?
Let's talk about Clue. I rewatched Tron Legacy after beating this game in preparation for this video, and I was very surprised to find that I still enjoy it. There were a lot of smaller details that I never picked up on as a child, and it really does fill in the gaps about many of these characters, especially Clue. The movie makes it pretty clear about the extent of his power and intelligence, and even explains how he managed to amass such a powerful army in such a seemingly short amount of time. Clue is more than just the system administrator. He was designed to be Flynn's equal in almost every way. Flynn had a single-minded devotion to his goals when he created the grid. He says himself that he wanted power, control, and perfection. Not power in the tyrannical sense, but he wanted to create the perfect system where all information could be shared freely. It's very likely that his experience in the old system from the 1982 film played a large part in this mindset. The Master Control Program was a tyrannical and restrictive force that left the system in a dystopian state, and maintaining power was the best way he could prevent that from happening to his new system. For several years, he and Clue were of the same mind, but Flynn had a change of heart after he discovered the ISOs. He no longer cared about creating a digital theme park for the rest of the world because their discovery was much greater. Programs with free will and a genetic code that wrote itself. Flynn started to realize the potential benefits that a discovery like this could have. Things like simulating diseases on them that could be studied to develop a cure with no harm to the ISOs themselves, since things like natural disease would not affect them. This isn't exactly laid out word for word in the movie, but it does seem to be Flynn's plan based on how he describes it, a digital frontier to reshape the human condition. Unfortunately for him, Clue didn't share this new initiative. There were several things that led to Clue's uprising, but the biggest one seems to be that he feels Flynn turned his back on him and their original mission to create the perfect system. Clue is an interesting character to me because he is quite literally Flynn frozen in time. This is a concept that isn't really taken as far as I think it should have been in the film, and it's barely even acknowledged in the game. I don't think that Clue retained all of Flynn's emotions when he was created, but he definitely carries over much of his personality and thought process. Theoretically, everything that Clue does is exactly what Flynn would have done at that moment in time. The difference is also the biggest problem. People can change, programs cannot. Clue was unable to see the ISOs the way Flynn did because he is bound by his directives and the single-minded devotion that was instilled in him whenever he was created. He never gave up on these goals because he is incapable of going against them, but Flynn isn't. It's no surprise then that he would start to feel like Flynn had turned his back on both him and the system as a whole. Flynn promised him that they were going to change the world together, and over time it became less about him and more about the ISOs. As things escalated, Clue began to see Flynn as a threat to his directives, so he offered him an ultimatum in the form of a simple question: am I still to create the perfect system? Is this still my top priority that should supersede all else? Since Flynn answered yes, then his only choice was to eliminate everybody who jeopardized this directive, including Flynn himself. If this game were truly writing a compelling story to complement the movie, then this should be the moment when Flynn realizes he is ultimately responsible for everything that happened. He was so busy seeing Clue as a friend and trying to reason with him like he would another human that he forgot he wasn't capable of that sort of change. He was created to build the perfect system, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Had Flynn been a little more utilitarian about things, he could have reprogrammed Clue to be more sympathetic to the ISOs, but he couldn't do that because that would have been immoral. He saw the programs as people, not programs. This is a realization that he eventually comes to in the film, but it could have been one that is expressed right here in this game. I'm not saying that Clue is the best written character I've ever seen in a game or a movie, but I did find these things about him interesting even if he is reduced to a comic book villain in many scenes. I think his representation in the film is much better and shows a little more of his real motivations. Still, most of the themes I just described are only hinted at in both the game and the movie, which is a shame because I think they're really interesting. Getting back to the story, Flynn tells you that Cora decided to sneak aboard Clue's warship. He wants you to go and rescue her since she's the last remaining ISO. He then gives you an upgrade that buffs your damage by a considerable amount. This is the last level in the game, and it was the moment I actually started having fun because it's the first time I felt like I was doing any real damage to enemies. You hop onto a nearby recognizer to get onto the warship. You then fight your way through when you see Cora was captured by Clue. She tells him, at disc point, that she saw everything he did to Flynn, Tron, and Radia. To nobody's surprise, Clue decides that she needs to die because she knows too much. Why would she say all this when she knows he can just easily kill her right here? Who knows? You swoop in an attempt to save the day, then get an extended combat section against various Blackguard troops as Flynn proceeds to not kill Cora for some reason. The Blackguards have an assload of health, and it's easier and more effective to just make them jump off the map. Once you're done fighting them, which I can't stress enough how long this takes, Abraxas is back for a rematch. Clue shoves Cora off the balcony instead of just killing her, and she's left unconscious. The fight against Abraxas has you running away from him and destroying the power nodes that he infects. You do this until he infects the main power node, and once you destroy it, the warship begins to self-destruct. You pick up Cora and make a jump for another recognizer, and then crash land nearby and are crushed by the recognizer. You could survive a nuclear blast on Arja, but this is what finally does you in. Cora wakes up just in time to see you die, and then she wanders the waste until she finds Flynn. There's some dialogue here that is supposed to tie into a conversation she has with Sam in the movie, except it's not what she says in the movie, so it's easy to just ignore. Once they wander off together, the game ends. Okay, let's be honest. This ending is stupid. Somehow Clue manages to survive his ship blowing up, and he couldn't have had time to evacuate because you didn't even have enough time to pick up Cora and jump out the hangar before shit hit the fan. That's secondary to Abraxas just magically appearing for another showdown that didn't need to happen in the first place. He was buried by a pile of rubble in Arja, which was then hit by a nuke. You can explain away your own survival by saying that Flynn pieced you back together, which is shown in the movie as something he's capable of doing. Unless Abraxas pulled an Alex Mercer, I don't see how he could have survived this. You're probably wondering what the point of Abraxas even was, and yeah, so do I. He isn't a compelling villain, and it's easy to forget that he even exists when the writers aren't hyping him up and giving him glorified god mode. His personal motivations don't make any sense, and we're left to just believe that Clue created him as some last-ditch effort to defame the ISOs and get Flynn on board with their extermination. His first death was anticlimactic, but there was really no reason for him to come back for another fight, and I think it stole the stage from what could have been an even greater ending. What if, instead of sending you on another mission to save Cora from the warship, literally a beat-by-beat recreation of what happened in the movie, Flynn sends you here to try and execute Clue. He doesn't have the heart to do it himself, and you're the only person he believes is capable. You corner him only to be met with Clue's secret weapon, Tron. It's revealed late in the movie that Tron has been reprogrammed by Clue to be his top enforcer, renamed Rinsler. This would be a better and more interesting fight than throwing a fistful of blackguards at you, and it would have given you a chance to fight against one of the more interesting antagonists from the movie. It would have also been the final plot twist that the game has to throw at you. Both Tron and Flynn survived, and now you have to fight against your former mentor, even if he's only your mentor for all of 5 minutes. You would ultimately lose this fight and be killed off by Rinsler, which I think would be a more satisfying and, dare I say, badass way of going out than getting crushed by a recognizer. They could still offer a cutscene showing what becomes of Cora, hopefully actually sticking with the dialogue that was given in the movie, but if there's one person in this game who is capable of killing Anon, it's Tron. Ideally, this wouldn't be the only change made in the story, but I think this one could at least offer a more satisfying ending than the one we have now. And that's Tron Evolution's story. After rewatching the movie, I don't think the two are even comparable. The movie beats the game in so many ways, and it's a shame because this setting offers a mountain of potential for great stories. I don't really have a lot to say about it other than what I already have, and it's a shame that this wasn't really given the time it needed to succeed. We'll likely never see another Tron game because of how this one turned out, and that means that Evolution finds its place in the realm of abandoned titles. Thanks for watching, guys. Before I get into the whole how my new work schedule has affected my channel part of this video, I wanted to offer a warm welcome to everybody new to the channel and thank a British Potato for sharing my Doom video last week. If you're the type of person who likes watching people react to stupid reviews or gaming drama in general, then feel free to check out his channel. I personally have to be in the mood for that sort of content, but there's some enjoyment to be found in it, and it was the reviews he covered on his channel that ultimately pushed me to make that video sooner than I planned, and I'm pretty proud of how it turned out. I mean, the game's received several updates since then, so I'm 100% sure that some of my criticisms are already outdated, but still, I think it's pretty good. I want to thank everybody who subscribed recently, and I urge you to stick around for what I have to say next, because it's basically regarding my upload schedule going forward. I started working full-time again and have been for the last month, so as you can imagine, this has had a big impact on my ability to make videos. The biggest reason that there was such a long stretch before this one came out was because I've spent the last 5 weeks in training, and I was working an 8:30 to 5:30 shift. Some of you are thinking, what's wrong with that? That gives you plenty of time in the evening to work on YouTube. This is true in theory, but I actually found myself feeling too drained to really have the motivation to do anything. My official shift is 12 to 9, and I finally get to start working these hours on Monday, which I've been looking forward to for over a month now. All that being said, I haven't spent all this time working on this one video. This took me probably around 2.5 weeks to get finished. That's still a really long time for something this short, but it's not like everything is going to take this long in the future. I'm still going to shoot for the 1 month mark for my uploads, but if I take a little bit longer, then at least you'll know why. I'm downright unwilling to compromise the quality or scale of my content just to fit a strict upload schedule, and I don't want to burn myself out on making videos because they won't be enjoyable anymore. And let's face it, if I'm not having fun making them, then I'm likely to stop. Of course, I don't have any plans of quitting, and I'm more than willing to work within these new limitations to deliver quality videos for you guys, but I also want everybody to be aware of my situation, so it doesn't seem like I'm just being lazy or that I've died or something. I really do appreciate all you guys for watching my videos. I'd be lying if I said I don't feel a sense of obligation to you at this point, and having to flex my upload schedule isn't something that I take lightly. I haven't even finished the script for the video that I'm working on currently, and I've actually considered dropping it altogether. I ultimately decided to stick with it because I've already dropped multiple projects this year, and I can see this one being really good if I will just stick with it, even if it means possibly having to edit another 3-hour video. Regardless, I just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of my situation and understand that I'm going to do my best to keep the videos coming until I can reach the coveted full-time YouTuber status. Except I have to keep this job for at least a full year or I owe my sign-on bonus back, so I guess it doesn't need to come too quickly. All the same, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.